This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. As the Russia-Ukraine military conflict enters its fourth week, both sides have suffered heavy casualties, while millions of people have fled their homeland. On the bright side, Kyiv and Moscow are still negotiating, and more countries are trying to help mediate the conflict. Can different parties work together to resolve the situation, to reach a peaceful conclusion, to stop the bloodshed? How do Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and all other relevant countries envision how the crisis will end? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, Russian defense analyst Pavel Falkenhauer, and Rick Denham, former White House correspondent for Business Week. That's our topic. I'm Xu Jinduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Tuesday marked the latest round of peace talks between Kyiv and Moscow. I will start with Pavel. The talks have concluded. So where are we now? A top Ukrainian advisor, described the negotiation as more constructive, while another described the talks as very difficult and viscous with fundamental contradictions.
Well, there's also, of course, today, just recently, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said that there is some positive signs, maybe, of a more reasonable Ukrainian position. So both sides are actually giving.
Seems we have a tech glitch here. So Andy, do you see any substantial progress in the latest round of talks?
Well, I think the fact that the Ukrainian side and the Russian side are talking is a good thing. But I think the important thing to recognize here is there is tremendous heated disagreement around the world about this conflict. And I think what is universally true is everyone, I would say even the Ukrainians and the Russians, want this conflict resolved as quickly and as peacefully as possible. But I think what's important to recognize here as well, and this is very, very important, is there's so much attention paid to the military aspect of this. But the larger battle, and I think some of the tectonic changes that are happening, are actually on the economic and the financial front. And this makes me think of something that Barack Obama is alleged to have said, that never underestimate Joe's ability to F things up, meaning President Joe Biden, in that the weaponization of the economic system, the financial system against Russia is creating tremendous uncertainty around the world. Gita Gopinath, the first managing director of the IMF, has said that some countries may very well rethink what currencies they should hold as reserves. And we all know that the US dollar really is the linchpin of American power and hegemony. And what the US may have started is the process of undermining this very linchpin. Look at Saudi Arabia. There have been talks for years, but maybe this time it's very serious, that they really need to diversify how they price their oil, not just in US dollars, but perhaps in yuan as well. And this could have tremendous tectonic changes. And I think this is something that we should pay attention to as well. The hope to eliminate really the terrible violence that's happening, but also recognize that there are really some big changes unleashed. And some of these are very unintentional and may actually ricochet to damage the U.S. in the long term.
Well, Rick, you are based in Washington. Why didn't you respond to that? If there is a concern inside of the U.S. that, by imposing those really biting sanctions on Russia, that somehow may hurt the U.S. too. For example, the position of U.S. dollar, because a central bank's reserve in U.S. dollars that could be frozen, as what we have seen in Russia's case.
Right. Well, I'll answer that in a moment. But first, I want to do what Andy didn't do, which was answer your other question, and that is that there is some progress. That the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, has said that it's not realistic that Ukraine would ever be a part of NATO. So that is that. I mean, that's a precondition, really, for any serious negotiations for peace with Russia to try to stop the invasion and the mass killings. In terms of what you're talking about with the dollar, I do think that this war is going to change the post World War II architecture, and in that way, I do agree with Andy. I think that there is a chance there will be more diversification of currencies. And yes, Russia is being forced because Russia is being squeezed so much. The oligarchs, the international money launderers are being squeezed so much right now, and Putin with his offshore billions of dollars, that they have to figure out a way beyond the monetary system of Europe. I mean, there's not even safety in Swiss banks right now. And so, yes, the UN, yes, other currencies, and yes, other countries might be part of this. We might be seeing, instead of the post-World War II economic architecture, we might see a fracturing right now where there are sort of two sets of economic architecture moving forward, one with a Chinese Russian axis and one with a U.S. European axis. I do think that what Andy said is true there.
Well, Pavel, you are back. Please continue your understanding, assessment of the latest round of talks.
Well, I say that both sides want to show themselves as champions of peace, but I believe the positions of the two sides are so diverse right now that's hardly possible. And actually, the composition of the teams, especially the Russian team, doesn't give much optimism. Mr. Medinsky, of course, is officially an aide to President Putin, but his standing in the Kremlin is not really serious. He doesn't know the issues much. And if, say, it would have been, say, Dmitry Kozak, then I would believe that the Kremlin really wants to negotiate some kind of compromise, say. But right now it seems that it's going to continue in the field. But both sides apparently will believe that they may achieve an advantage on the battlefield, and that while they believe in that, they're going to continue.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pavel,
Right.
Obviously, as Rick said, Zelensky, the president of the Ukrainian side, saying that basically the country should recognize that Ukraine may not join NATO. So he's somehow laying the ground that to meet the number one request from the Russian side. Isn't that a very positive sign?
Oh, that's not really the number one request, actually, because it's well understood in Moscow that Ukraine is not becoming NATO member anytime soon anyway, so that's not that. Russia was demanding that Ukrainian government, anyone which is more or less legitimately sitting in Kyiv, should recognize Crimea as Russian, and maybe recognize the independence of the Donbas republics, and disarm the country so that it becomes a Russian-friendly buffer state. That's what will be the main Russian objectives. That's more or less what they're saying right now. A neutral, friendly Ukraine, basically a buffer state, a very weak buffer state, to be eventually gobbled up most likely by unified, or say, with Russia. So on the Ukrainian side, yes, they're getting lots of punishment, and a lot of people are being killed, and they're getting more angry. And I don't believe that right now the Ukrainian public opinion is ready to accept Russian conditions. And the mediators that are trying to mediate, well, they don't need to mediate because the sides are already talking. I mean, you don't need to put them behind the table. What you need is to put pressure on both sides to get some kind of results, to begin to compromise on matters of very serious principle.
Yeah, Rick, obviously it's very difficult for the Ukrainian side to recognize Crimea is a part of Russia, and also the independence of the two republics in the eastern part of the country. I mean, even the government, you simply can't do that. Otherwise, the public opinion will be up in the sky and will overthrow the government.
Right. I agree with you. I mean, it would lose its legitimacy internally. to do that. I mean, Crimea, they may eventually have to accept de facto Russian control after Russia seized it in 2014. The issues of the breakaway areas of eastern Ukraine is another one. I mean, ultimately, yes, you could see them absorbed into Russia as a grand compromise, but I don't think right now that is at all possible. And the other thing that Pavel mentioned is a non-starter, that basically you would not have self-determination in Ukraine, and you would have it as a puppet state that would ultimately be absorbed into the new Russian Empire. I don't think that's possible, but you know, I mean, there are steps. I think Pavel really nailed it and told us the reality, which is until you get serious negotiators, until you get a team that has power to actually do something, that right now it's more talk. But it's better to have talk than no talk. I mean, it's better to have some negotiations and some chance for peace than absolutely zero.
It's good to have talks. Yeah, Andy, go ahead. And
if I may.
Yes, and also, Andy, I want to ask you, because leaders of NATO members, including the U.S. and the Canadian leaders, will travel to Brussels next week for NATO summit. Obviously, President Biden will be there. So, what kind of a role do you think that meeting may play in the conflict?
Sure. Well, so what I'd like to respond to Pavel's comment and also answer your question at the same time, Tingdua. So I would say that actually these negotiations, discussions are in some sense irrelevant. And I think that the reason why the Ukrainians are doing such a good job of holding off the Russians really has nothing to do with Ukrainian resolve or bravery. It's really just the supply that the West, mostly the U.S., is providing in terms of arms, other support. And what will really bring peace is if the economic pain that is being levied on the West, if energy prices, food prices double or triple, I think that there will be a radical rethinking of whether the West can continue to support Ukraine. And if they stop, I think the Ukrainians will have no choice but to capitulate. So this is one of the important drivers. Now, what's going to happen with the NATO leaders meeting? I think there's going to be these questions because they do have to consider, from their perspective, legitimate national security interests, as Russia does as well. But they also have to consider the economic and financial fallout as well. And in particular, Germany is especially vulnerable. And there are some who make the argument that Germany's interest actually lies more with Russia than the United States, but this is a taboo topic that people cannot say to take a non-Atlanticist stand, but in their hearts. And I talk to investors in the energy sector who say that, the Germans really think, at least some Germans think this, but they just can't express it right now.
Yeah, well, it's... The political atmosphere is very heated, understandably. Now let's take a pause on the discussion. Earlier I spoke with Diana Gantagieva, a Bulgarian independent investigative journalist. She conducted an investigation into biological experiments in Ukraine. Let's take a look at what she said. Welcome to the show, Diana. So you have done investigation into the biological experiments in Ukraine, experiments you said, and now we know, financed by the U.S. side. Tell us, what did you find?
According to documents which I published, the United States has conducted biological experiments on allied soldiers in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, also in Georgia. According to these documents, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, which is part of the Pentagon, has funded biological experiments on 4,400 soldiers in Ukraine and 1,000 soldiers in the Republic of Georgia. According to these leaked documents that I published, and I'm quoting now, this is the exact quotation, all volunteer deaths will be promptly reported. This raises questions as to what medical procedures will be conducted that could lead to such a lethal risk to the study participants. According to these documents, the Pentagon funded a project on local soldiers involving blood draws, and these bloods taken from the soldiers will be tested for the presence of antibodies against bioagents. Bioagents are dangerous bacteria, toxins, and viruses that could easily be weaponized and used as bioweapons. But in the documents, it is not indicated what exactly medical procedures are going to be conducted on these soldiers that could lead to deaths, because it is written, all volunteer deaths will be promptly reported.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned the documents, Diana. So are those documents from the laboratories or from the Ukrainian government?
All documents that I have collected and published so far originate from the US government and from this Defense Threat Reduction Agency program in Ukraine and in Georgia. They are authentic documents. They originate from the US government database, and they are not conspiracy theory. They are not propaganda. These are official documents or internal documents originating from the program.
Mm-hmm. The response from the Ukrainian government, the Pentagon, the State Department, of the United States, is that they have this unequivocal denial of any biological weapons research in Ukraine. They say this is for the purpose of stopping the spread of weapons of mass destruction or the spread of those diseases, deadly diseases. What's your response to that?
U.S. Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland testified under oath in the U.S. Senate committee that Ukraine has biological research facilities, and the United States is very worried that those biological research materials could fall into the Russian hands. If these were just simple viruses, bacteria, and toxins, simply for reference purposes, for simple, ordinary research purposes, then why are US officials so worried that they may fall into the Russian hands? What are these research materials in the first place? So if this was simple biological research, nothing to do with risky experiments, then why are US officials so worried?
Another interesting, discovery, available in the media is that those biolabs, operated by the Ukrainian side and the US side. Basically, from the Ukrainian side is health of the ministry, but from the US side is really the Pentagon, the Department of Defense. Why not the health department, but the Pentagon? This is about a defense or offensive cooperation, operation. Is there any clear explanation from the side of Washington?
There has been no explanation so far as to why the Pentagon signed such an agreement with the Ukrainian Ministry of Health. According to a 2005 agreement between the Pentagon and the Ukrainian Ministry of Health, certain information under this program is sensitive information. The Ukrainian Ministry of Health is not allowed to publicly disclose this sensitive information. The Ukrainian side is obliged to transfer dangerous pathogens to the Pentagon under this agreement. And here comes the question, why did the Pentagon need such pathogens, dangerous pathogens, to be transferred to the United States? Also, something very important, information also again based on documents. The activities of the Pentagon in Ukraine and Georgia under this biological threat reduction program fall under special provisions in agreement signed by both countries with the United States. According to these special provisions, all US government personnel, including US military scientists, are indemnified for deaths or injuries caused to the local population. They cannot be held to account if they cause deaths or injuries to the local population.
But also there are people who think the latest topic of this alleged bioweapons program in Ukraine, they say this is a propaganda war, this is a disinformation war between Russia and the United States. What do you make of that?
There is, I don't see where the propaganda here is. We are talking about documents, also confirmation that was made by US government officials. Where is the propaganda? The information comes from the United States. It doesn't come from propaganda sources. It is verifiable and it is easy to verify. I started investigating this Pentagon funded by laboratories 4 years ago, long before the war in Ukraine. And this claim that this is propaganda, it is simply not true. It is an attempt to redirect public attention from these biolaboratories by simply claiming it's Russian propaganda. I don't see any sense in such a claim because the US government simply doesn't want to answer very important questions. As to you rightly noticed, this program is run by the Pentagon, not the US Department of Health. Why do we have such a military program taking place in civil biolaboratories? These are not military biolaboratories. What for? We need international public control group that will monitor the activities of these biolaboratories. We need full transparency and public control. Unless this happens, these biolaboratories must stop their risky biological research.
Well, thank you, Dilyana. Thank you for speaking to us. Well, welcome back. Rick, you were shaking your heads at the beginning of her response,
Right,
her
exactly.
explanation. Go ahead, please.
It's breathtaking to me. First, I will say, I as a journalist, I'm in favor of transparency, and the Russian biological and chemical weapons facility should be open. Chinese should be open. American should be open. I mean, obviously, the world should be able to know if there are any offensive weapons. Secondly, let's talk about the use and sort of what I would consider a red herring about the Defense Department. I mean, when you have a history of Russia using biological chemical weapons, you do need to figure out how you deal with it. I mean, how are you going to defend? How are you going to treat? And then that goes back in time. And then more recently with Syria, where you had the Syrian government using chemical and biological weapons on its own people in the civil war. And I was on this very show where a Russian commentator was saying that it was actually British planes that were doing it, and it was a fake operation. They were trying to blame the Syrians for doing it when it wasn't. Well, and then we look at this reporter, in quotation marks, reporter, and if you look in the past, I mean, she has had alleged scoops in Syria that ended up being completely phony, and she has been accused of operating black PR campaigns for the Kremlin, and her IP address has been linked to Russia. I wouldn't call her independent. I'm not saying that everything that she's saying is wrong. It's just that it's sort of irresponsible to have all of these dots and connect them in the most odious ways. What I fear is we have an operation of disinformation going on now that will lay the predicate for Russian troops or Russian planes to use biological and chemical weapons in Ukraine. If that happens, I think that we are going to be at a level in the war that we don't want to go to, and one where there won't be turning back. So I hope this is just sort of a story that the Chinese and Russian media are blowing out of proportion, as opposed to something that's completely false. But I do worry because this is giving legitimacy to a report that just is not considered plausible in most of the world now.
But Rick, when Under Secretary Victoria Nuland was at a hearing, right? She was asked by Mark Rubio, whether the U.S. run biological weapon program in Ukraine. She didn't give a categorical no about that program.
Right.
Instead, she said, well, we do have biological research facilities. I think it's legitimate for people to have suspicion, what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine with those biolabs.
Correct.
Yeah.
I agree with you. But to draw the conclusion from that is true. To draw the conclusion then that is leading to biological weapons that will be used against Russia or could be used against Russia is like saying the lab in Wuhan, because there was possibility that there was a leak of the coronavirus, that China caused it. That's irresponsible. I mean, it was utterly irresponsible when Western media said China was responsible for COVID because of a leak in the lab.
That's right,
to
Rick.
Me,
I think you have a point. Let me bring in Andy. I think Rick is right, Andy. If anyone draw conclusion that there is a biological weapon program, obviously that's not based on solid evidence. But I'm talking about, people do have suspicion. I think the U.S. side should provide more information, more transparency about those programs.
Well, I think there's a couple things going on here, although I think Rick did modulate his attack. He's basically making an ad hominem attack by attacking the person. And, someone that was inaccurate or maybe even perhaps, and I'm not saying that the person just talking about this is doing this, but even if someone has lied in the past, doesn't mean that what they've said now is truthful or not. So I think that is really kind of a fallacious line of reasoning. The second is that it's certainly natural, and I think even a good idea, to ask questions. We know that the U.S. Certainly has a history, maybe even a long history, of operations and projects that it has denied. Everything from NSA spying as revealed by Edward Snowden, going further back, bombing in Cambodia, etc. That it's perfectly legitimate to ask these questions. And I think that comparing it to the Wuhan lab is completely spurious. We can see very clearly the U.S. has publicly, officially said that Russia and China are its opponents in the national security strategy in 2017, which the Biden administration has not walked back or changed. That why wouldn't the U.S. do something like this, right? So I think questions are legitimate, but we should not jump to conclusions. And let's just see. And I'm actually very curious about the neuralgic reaction from the Western media that, it's preposterous to even think something like this, which is very odd to me.
Well, we have to stop there, gentlemen. With that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.